airports all over, major airports, now have, many parked aircraft on the ground, and they're going to be there for a while.
Here, American Airlines is using Tulsa International Airport as a parking lot for many of its jets. There's currently over 50 grounded airplanes parked here.
Nothing this big has ever landed in the atmosphere. More than a dozen planes are now sitting in a storage facility at the Outback Airport.
Aircraft range in size. For scale, a standard football field is 160 feet wide. A narrow-body jet like Boeing 737 has a wingspan of 117 feet, but wide-body airliners can be twice that. The world's largest plane, Airbus's A380, has a wingspan of 261 feet. Even aircraft manufacturer Airbus is being asked to help.
Our customers have come to us and said, look, we're parking literally hundreds of aircraft per day, and we have a huge amount of maintenance work to do with that. And we've created a particular app, and that's an app that helps our customers to work out exactly how much maintenance is needed, and even that enables them to very quickly optimize how to park the aircraft, where to park them, and also to prepare them when they come out of service when this is through.
Airbus, along with Boeing, dominate the commercial aircraft industry, and together make up 91% of the market share. Airbus has over 11,000 planes in operation. Skywise is a digital platform the manufacturer offers its customers to keep up the health of an aircraft. It collects data from systems and sensors to help predict maintenance, as well as help with logistics of daily operations. Airbus has added a new feature to help airlines find parking. Parking an airplane isn't as easy as just finding a spot. Factors like how long the plane will be out of service and what type of maintenance needs to be done play a role in finding a location.
The decision is made as to whether it's basically storage or whether it's actual parking. Now, parking is typically relatively short term. It's a bit like putting something in the fridge compared to longer term storage, which would be where you put it in the freezer. So certain pieces of maintenance must be done before you can park up an aircraft, even if it's just for a couple of days.
These aircraft cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and maintaining them is not cheap. Even when parked, they need to run the engines, cycle fluids, and move the tires among many other checklist items. This is why some airlines are flying with just a few passengers aboard, just to keep them running. When airlines know the plane is going to sit for months at a time, they're sent to the desert, because the dry climate helps prevent corrosion.
If it sits on the ground for 1 or 2 months and it hasn't been operated that whole time, it requires a lot more maintenance to bring it back into service than, let's say, if it's been started up every 10 days or so. I was just speaking with the head of maintenance for a significant U.S. airline, and what this person told me is that right now they're actually keeping 2x, in other words, twice as many active, and they're rotating them, in and out. So that way, for those other aircraft, you won't have to worry about the more extensive maintenance to bring them back into service.
At the moment, we have about 80% of the fleet in parking mode.
Etihad Airways, for example, returned over 100 planes to its main base in Abu Dhabi, where it sealed up engines and sensors to prevent things like sand from getting into critical areas.
They're very intricate, compact parking a car.
The outlook for coronavirus is still unclear. Boeing told its shareholders that air travel could take 2 to 3 years to return to normal. Airlines have had to consolidate fleets to cut back on costs.
International travel has been hurt the most, and with good reason, and it's very difficult now to travel between countries. This means that long-haul aircraft, which are generally what we call twin aisles or wide bodies, are going to suffer more than single aisles like the 737 and A320. The A380, the big double-decker that Airbus launched, a little bit over a decade ago, every one of those is on the ground. 100% of the A380s are parked. The larger it is and the older it is, the more it suffers. So when you down gauge, you're going to go to the smallest aircraft, the most economical aircraft.
Airlines before coronavirus were doing great. They had the highest employment levels in the United States at least. In 17 years, they were hiring like crazy pilots, flight attendants, expecting this big rush in travel to continue, and we've seen it over the last decade of profitability, and now they're going to be posting the first losses in years.
Airlines have seen incredible losses, and analysts don't expect that to stop anytime soon. Like many businesses, large and small, they are in survival mode and looking for ways to conserve cash. Lack of demand could lead to canceling or deferring future orders from manufacturers. Airbus and Boeing have already cut back on production, and both companies are planning to slash jobs. As for the thousands of aircraft parked around the world, retirement could come much earlier than expected.
One thing to understand is that before this crisis hit, airlines couldn't get these planes fast enough. One of their biggest complaints was that aircraft were delayed, so the market for aircraft was very high. Airbus and Boeing, which dominate aircraft production, had been sold out of some of their best sellers through pretty much the middle of the decade, so it was even hard to get a slot. We're going to see that kind of reverse, and you'll see some cancellations, you'll see deferrals, and you'll see that market sort of loosen up. But some airlines, because fuel is such a big cost, they do want more fuel-efficient aircraft going forward, but the timing of when they get those planes, that's going to change. It'll all depend on when demand comes back.
6,000 of these are 15 years or older. 4,000 of these are, 20 years or more. And so they're already approaching retirement age. And we're in a situation now where we have thousands of excess aircraft. So if you're an airline and you're deciding what aircraft you're going to keep around, you don't want to spend millions of dollars on maintenance to keep your older aircraft around for them to fly in the next year. So the impact here is dramatic.
There is no timeline for when the world will return back to normal. So for now, much of these aircraft will sit waiting for the return to normalcy like the rest of us.
America has dominated global finance since the end of the Second World War, when the current system was built.
Designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation.
But the economic disaster caused by the coronavirus pandemic could signal a new chapter in financial history, with America's leadership called into question.
COVID-19 has shown that America is failing to sort out its own affairs at home, let alone provide global leadership.
$484 billion for loans after the first round of funding ran out.
Another huge spike in unemployment claims.
With a vacuum emerging at the top of the financial order, China is vying to compete for greater control.
This is not a case of China becoming Wall Street overnight. The crisis has provided China with an opportunity to show what it's capable of doing, which, in the long run, will tip the balance of power.
In global finance, America is king. It controls the world's financial plumbing and accounts for almost a quarter of the world economy. The dollar makes up most central bank reserves and is the currency of international trade. 80% of global supply chains use dollars, which gives America significant power.
Whoever controls the flows of money at the end of the day controls a lot of things in the economy and ends up being the puppet master of a lot of things that go on around the world.
China hopes to correct this imbalance.
There is a growing call from the international community for reforming the global economic governance system, which is a pressing task for us.
It already has the world's second largest economy. Its banks are enormous. The banking sector has been growing fairly steadily for the past 10 years, while in America, bank assets have remained relatively stable. And with European banks' assets falling, Chinese banks now have more assets than those in Europe or America. But most of their business is within China. Chinese banks account for only 7% of cross-border lending. So the bank's vast size hasn't translated into influence.
To use the currency, Rio Tinto, which is one of the largest iron ore miner in the world, issued its first contract in yuan last year.
The COVID-19 pandemic could increase China's financial influence.
China is now sharing its experience with the rest of the world and providing much-needed supplies.
30 tons of equipment to Italy, 500,000 surgical masks to Spain.
Following the outbreak in Wuhan, China has positioned itself as a global leader, containing the outbreak, agreeing to deals to suspend repayment of some of its loans, and charging ahead with vaccine development.
The COVID crisis, at least so far, has cast a negative shadow on the capacity for leadership of America. It did not try or even show interest in marshalling a global response to this crisis.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
This could offer an opportunity for China because it's tried to fill the vacuum that America has left in terms of global leadership.
China's tough response to the crisis and the growing size and depth of its financial markets have helped convince investors it's a safe bet, even as COVID sent other markets crashing. While emerging markets saw the value of bonds plummet earlier this year, China's government bonds remain stable, which is a good gauge of trust in a country's economy.
So China has the second biggest bond market in the world. COVID provided the first test that this bond market could resist a crisis in a way that typically emerging market bonds don't. It shows investors trust China as an economy that they don't think it's going to collapse overnight.
As well as improving its reputation with international investors, China hopes to increase its hold over how money moves around the world. America has huge influence over the current system, thanks to SWIFT, the world's largest network for transferring money. It's a messaging system that allows financial institutions to communicate. It's meant to be geopolitically neutral. But because a majority of SWIFT transactions are in dollars, and these are routed through New York, America has used the system to choke its adversaries. Russia feared being excluded after its invasion of Crimea, and some Iranian banks were blocked from using the system in 2018 to enforce US sanctions.
So SWIFT is based in Belgium, so it is supposed to be neutral. However, over it, America can also threaten SWIFT with sanctions what America wants. This is very upsetting for its allies, which would rather the system stays neutral and for the benefit of everyone.
For now, China can't hope to challenge America's dominance of SWIFT. Instead, Chinese companies are targeting a different part of the financial system, the way in which consumers spend their money. Most consumer payments rely on American giants Visa and MasterCard. But Chinese tech companies have developed a series of apps that disrupt this system. Rather than using bank accounts or credit cards for transactions, consumers load money into digital wallets. Consumers can then do almost anything, from paying parking fines to making investments or ordering taxis, without any of this money flowing through the banks, creating a parallel financial ecosystem.
This is potentially very disruptive to the financial system. It changes the way the money moves around the world. It empowers a new set of companies which are so big that even the Chinese government is scared of them.
Last year, Chinese customers made mobile payments worth a total of $49 trillion. And the two main Chinese companies offering this tech, Tencent and Ant Financial, are enormous, with 1 billion users each. COVID-19 may increase their reach.
People are doing more shopping online, trying to stay away from cash, which is seen as a potential contaminant. And this is all to the benefit of electronic payment firms.
Ant Financial and Tencent are already expanding overseas. Ant Financial's app, Alipay, is accepted in 56 countries and regions. And other digital wallet firms are buying into their tech. Alipay's QR format has already been adopted by 6 European mobile wallets.
America has reasons to be worried about the Chinese giants. They are getting bigger in the region because they are investing the wallets in Southeast Asia and beyond. And in effect, it creates a system that is not reliant on American companies, American standards, American norms.
But China faces a major obstacle. Much of the world distrusts its intentions.
China denying a cover-up.
Top Chinese officials kept it quiet.
After all, Chinese leaders initially denied and covered up the spread of COVID-19.
There is always a doubt about what is the ultimate objective that China is pursuing in being so collaborative at the present time. It is not always transparent about the truth and what happens in its own country. In a global financial system, you need transparency, you need to know the facts, what's going on, to make sure the system is in good health.
As China's financial sphere of influence grows, it's unclear whether it will complement America's by creating more competition or undermine the existing system.
In the end, what we could see is the fragmentation of the global financial system in an America-dominated sphere and a China-dominated sphere. These two systems don't have to be mutually exclusive, they could actually collaborate with each other. If they do, great. If they don't, then it will be harder to move money around the world. It will be a costlier, a more dangerous financial system, and in the end, most people will lose out.
China mayn't force in global finance anytime soon, but COVID-19 is helping to fast-track its progress. And as the world recovers from the virus and economies begin to open up, China will be well placed to make significant gains.
Thanks for watching. I'm Mathieu Favas, finance correspondent at The Economist, and if you want to read more about how the COVID crisis is going to change the financial system, please click the link opposite.
I'm Edward Carr, The Economist Deputy Editor.
Hello, my name's Callum Williams. I'm Senior Economics Writer at The Economist, and I am joining Ed to answer your questions on this call.
I'd like to think that's what would happen. I'm not sure it is what's going to happen. And partly because I think we're going to go through a very, very difficult time in the economy. And big economic disruptions tend to unsettle politics and to create grievances and resentments. The second thing is a context in which this pandemic struck, and it's one in which the post-Second World War order is breaking down, where China is clearly the rising power, where the United States, certainly under Donald Trump, has either a less willingness or capacity to be able to play the role of sort of overarching power who is prepared to get involved all over the world to try and sort out people's problems. And I think that sort of sense of a world that's slightly falling apart and a more rivalrous world where the United States is worried about China's power, the pandemic has come and hit the world at just when those issues are becoming more intense. And so I fear that it makes them harder to solve rather than easier to solve.
This era of globalization was very much slowing long before the COVID pandemic came along, and that was only partly related to the election of Donald Trump. It was slowing even before he became president, and I think that was the kind of lingering after effect of the financial crisis. But you know what the historical experience tends to show is that crises tend to kind of reinforce pre-existing trends, and deglobalization was one of them. Financial markets are hoping on this idea of a V-shaped recession, and that's the idea that, you know, in one quarter or perhaps in 2 quarters, GDP will decline by perhaps an astonishing amount, but because lockdowns will come to an end, people will make up for lost time, and you'll see a quick rebound back to where we were. I think what people are now starting to wonder is whether that really is going to happen, and in particular, they're looking at what's happening in China, which began to ease its lockdown in kind of late February and March. And at the moment, I mean, it's certainly the case that economic activity has recovered from its lows, but it's still a long way off. The Chinese economy is running at about 90% capacity of compared with what it was at before the pandemic hit. And that's really for a few reasons. You know, what you're seeing is that people are going back to the office and going back to the factory and all that kind of stuff, basically because they have to. But what they're not doing is going out and money, having a good time, investing in big things. And what that means is that the sort of in bars, in shops and all that kind of thing. There just isn't really demand for their services. And so I think what you're going to start to see now is, as various American states start to loosen their lockdowns, and of course as Europe starts to come out of a lockdown, I think it's very unlikely we're going to get back to where we were at the beginning of this year.
The first effects of this disease was an interruption of supply chains, and I think that might remain with companies in that they might diversify their supply chains, and that was kind of happening anyway because China was becoming a more expensive place to manufacture things. As against that, supply chains have a strong sort of driving force for getting costs down and of being optimized, and they're pretty intolerant of inefficiencies, and so that will still sort of be pushing very strongly in the other direction.
I guess one thing I might add to that is to think about the financial system and about how that will, how a company is able to access finance in order to start producing stuff. What you're seeing now really across the world is really unprecedented levels of uncertainty. And so I think what you could see is that financing new projects and getting people to commit to projects could actually become very difficult. And this is starting to show up in the data now, where if you look at surveys of managers, they're asked, what are your plans for investment and so on. They're much in the absolute depths of the financial crisis of 2000. Some people really thought the financial system was going to come to a complete stop. It's held up a mirror to the most vulnerable aspects of society. I mean, Singapore is a great example of that. It's a country that apparently had dealt with the outbreak extremely well, and then a few weeks down the line, there's these huge outbreaks in the migrant labour camp that keep the Singaporean economy going and are the kind of seedy underbelly of the Singaporean economy, and people there have very poor access to healthcare. And of course, there are still millions of people who are uninsured in the US, and there are worries that those people, and particularly if people lose their jobs, that people will be less willing to go forward for testing and so on. So I think what you could see, and this perhaps would be one of the biggest upsides of the whole pandemic, is that the idea of a universal access to healthcare that's free at the point of use could start to become common sense in all countries. So I think the pandemic will make states more powerful. If you look back at centuries of Western history, there's sort of two lessons that emerge about the power of states. One is that it tends to increase over time as a kind of background effect, and the second is that states tend to become a lot more powerful both during and immediately after periods of crisis. Normally in a recession what happens is that the state, it doesn't like saying this, but it kind of accepts that in a recession businesses will go bust and people will become unemployed. And it says that's okay because the idea is that you want to, reallocate people and capital and all that kind of stuff from areas that were failing to areas that are up and coming. And that's how it normally works. But what's happening this time is that states and governments and politicians are saying, basically, if we can, we want to avoid all bankruptcies and we want to make sure that nobody becomes unemployed. What that does is it opens the door to really significant government intervention in the economy going forward. So, let's imagine that in a few years we've sort of moved beyond this pandemic, but of course there will be another recession at some point down the line. I think if it's generally accepted that the government did a pretty good job during this crisis of protecting jobs and protecting firms, then people will say, well, hang on, if it worked last time, then why not do it again? So I think we could see quite radical changes in sort of expectations of what the state should do and what the state thinks it's legitimate for it to do.
You often hear people say that one thing, at least good thing that's come out of the pandemic is that it's been good for the climate. You can calculate, how many hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon dioxide haven't been put into the atmosphere because there have been fewer flights and so forth. And I suppose there is a sort of demonstration effect. People might, this is in a sense something that doesn't normally happen. But as against that, a poorer world, a world to invest, and a world that's worried about unemployment and life and death, is a world that I think is less inclined to invest in the transformation of the world to a sort of carbon-free economy. There's one big wrinkle on that, however, which is the oil industry. The price has collapsed. Countries in the Middle East, Russia, Venezuela, that depended upon oil as a very important, the main source of their foreign exchange earnings, are suddenly finding that they aren't getting enough money to do the things they want to do. Oil companies are beginning to see that perhaps the oil price might not recover for a very long time. That also is giving people a sort of inkling and a glimpse that there may be a future without oil, which is a very important component of the transition to away from a carbon-based economy.
I mean, it's going to become more distant, I suppose, in the sense that I think, if you're going to have a meeting with someone face to face, for the foreseeable future, that has to be a pretty worthwhile meeting. So I think the idea of going for a speculative coffee with someone will seem, at least for a while, kind of weird. You'll reserve your ventures out of the house for people that you sort of know you're going to have a productive time with. So I think that will potentially, reduce the exchange of ideas and that kind of thing. And I think the same goes for travel, business travel and research travel and so on. If you look at what's happened, say, in the scientific community and in economics, most papers, research papers now, most research projects involve a large team of people, and also a growing proportion of those projects involve people in more than one country. Normally that might be America or Canada, but you do get incredible diversity and cooperation. And I think that if meeting people and traveling becomes harder, you can see a really, really big hit to innovation, patenting, and all that kind of stuff. Probably quite a lot. So we did an analysis a couple of weeks ago looking at which countries that were going to be most affected potentially by the turn down. And if you look at the very top of the ranking, so the countries most affected, they are tourism-dependent economies. Greece comes, unfortunately, right at the top, and then Italy and Spain are pretty near the top as well. Turkey also is very high up there. Particularly in Europe, tourism ministers are starting to talk to each other and say, how can we make this work? If Greece doesn't have a tourist season this summer, its economy is in really, really serious trouble. So what I expect you'll start to see is people thinking, pretty creatively about what they might do. So if you take the example of Israel, earlier this week they said that hotels could reopen, but you could only stay on the ground floor. I actually remain fairly optimistic about, say, the prospects that people will be able to travel and so on. I think it might become something that's open to fewer people. If the flight from, say, London to Spain is only allowed to be 2/3 full because of the required social distancing, then that means the ticket prices will have to go up, and so it will be available to fewer people. But my sense is that because this is such an important issue for some countries, that people will find a way of making this work, if at all possible. If you'd like to sign up to our newsletter on coronavirus for more updates, click the link opposite. And thank you for watching.
Nobody knew there'd be a pandemic.
When Trump first talked about the coronavirus earlier this week,
the coronavirus, which is very well under control in our country. have very few people with it. The people are getting better. They're all getting better. I think that whole situation will start working out. A lot of talent, a lot of brain power is being put behind it. $2.5 billion we're putting in. There's a very good chance you're not going to die.
Okay, we're definitely all going to die.
I've just received another briefing from a great group of talented people. We're ready to adapt and we're ready to do whatever disease spreads, if it spreads. The level that we've had in our country is very low and those people are getting better. We're very, very ready for this. I'm going to be putting our Vice President, Mike Pence, in charge. I'm going to ask Mike Pence to say a few words, please. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. President.
I still feel safer with him than with Trump. Right? Because Trump, first of all, if you saw the briefing, didn't seem to know anything that we didn't. It's like he just gets his news online with us. Just like, I saw a thing, it looks bad, it's really pretty bad. It's like some people have it, a lot of people have it, you might have it, I don't even know if I have it. And earlier this week, when Trump was briefed on the virus, he seemed less concerned about a pandemic hurting people than he was about it hurting the economy. Because that's Trump's real nightmare, right? If his stock market gets sick, yeah, he would be like, no, not my poor stock market, not Wall Street chicken soup.
लिए ये लेक्चर्स जो है बड़े मददगार साबित होंगे, क्योंकि